Tiffany Henyard was not always known as the Dolton Dictator. Her beginnings were humble, her story one that initially inspired the people who would one day call for her removal. She was a symbol of change, a woman who had defied the odds to rise to a position of power in a small Illinois town that had long been plagued by economic struggles and political stagnation. She had charisma, presence, and a vision, or at least, that was what the people believed when they placed their faith in her leadership. Dolton, a suburban village south of Chicago, had seen better days. Once a thriving community, it had been on a slow decline for years. Businesses had shuttered, crime rates had crept up, and the people had grown tired of being promised change that never came. The town needed someone new, someone different, and Tiffany Henyard presented herself as exactly that. She ran her campaign with the promise of renewal, of revitalization, of a future that looked brighter than the decaying structures and struggling families that defined the Dolton of the present. She understood what the people wanted to hear. Her words were sharp, confident, and reassuring. She spoke of transformation, of taking Dolton back from the grips of economic despair and ushering it into a new era of prosperity. She promised jobs, lower crime, improved infrastructure, and a community that would finally be put first. The people listened. The people believed. It was not an easy election, but she emerged victorious. The moment she was sworn in as the mayor of Dolton, there was celebration in the streets. People clapped, cheered, and embraced the idea that they had found their leader. It was a historic moment. A young black woman rising to power in a place that had long been dominated by the same familiar faces. A victory for representation, for progress, for the town itself. At first, things seemed to be going as promised. Henyard made public appearances, met with community leaders, and announced ambitious projects meant to revitalize Dolton. There was a buzz of excitement, a cautious optimism that perhaps, finally, the town had a mayor who would make good on their promises. Her first major initiative was an infrastructure renewal project, a plan designed to improve the roads, repair broken streetlights, and clean up neglected public spaces. It was the type of action that people had been waiting for. Signs were put up across town announcing upcoming developments, banners bearing the mayor's name as a reminder of who was responsible for this new beginning. Her administration made sure to publicize these efforts, ensuring that every move was broadcast across social media and local news outlets. Pictures of her standing beside construction crews, walking through neighborhoods, shaking hands with business owners. Every step was meticulously crafted to build the image of a hands-on mayor, someone who was not simply making promises but actively working to fulfill them. But beneath the surface, something was already beginning to shift. Behind closed doors, conversations were taking place that the public would never hear. Money was moving in directions that few could track. Allies were being made, and those who asked too many questions were being pushed aside. The first real signs of trouble appeared in small, almost imperceptible ways. Contractors involved in the infrastructure projects reported unusual delays in payment. Local officials found themselves excluded from meetings they once had access to. Certain businesses, ones with close personal ties to Henyard, began receiving special considerations while others struggled to navigate newly imposed bureaucratic obstacles. The town's finances, once stable despite its struggles, became increasingly difficult to scrutinize. Budget allocations stopped making sense. Funding for essential services was suddenly reduced, redirected into projects that looked impressive on paper but lacked transparency in execution. Still, the people did not see the cracks forming. They were still caught up in the excitement of new leadership, still hopeful that change was coming. As the months passed, Henyard solidified her power. She surrounded herself with loyalists, removing individuals from the administration who dared to challenge her decisions. Some were fired, others resigned under the pressure. The turnover rate within the local government quietly increased, but the general public did not see this as a warning sign. It was simply a restructuring, the mayor bringing in new people to help push her vision forward. Public relations became her greatest weapon. Every public event was meticulously controlled, each appearance designed to reinforce the image of a beloved leader. She held town halls, but questions were carefully selected. She made speeches, but they lacked real substance, filled instead with carefully curated phrases that promised progress without offering specifics. Her social media presence grew. Lavish photo shoots, professionally crafted statements, perfectly timed interactions with community members. Every move she made was calculated. Her supporters remained loyal, seeing only what was placed in front of them. The roads were being fixed, weren't they? The town looked cleaner, more presentable than it had in years. Why question success? Why challenge the leader who had finally brought some light back into Dolton? But those who worked within the system, those who had once been part of Dolton's local government, knew something was off. The financial reports did not add up. The decisions made behind closed doors benefited only a select few. The transparency she had once promised had evaporated, replaced by a culture of secrecy and intimidation. The first whistleblowers tried to speak out, but they were quickly silenced. Those who raised concerns found themselves pushed out of their positions, their reputations suddenly under attack. It was no longer just leadership, it was control. The mayor's influence extended beyond government. Local businesses felt the pressure. Community organizations that did not align with her narrative lost funding or access to town resources. Those who questioned her faced quiet retribution, not through direct confrontation, but through a series of calculated decisions that made life difficult for dissenters. By the time the public started to take notice, Henyard's grip on power was already too strong. The mayor who had once been seen as a beacon of hope was now an undeniable force of control. People whispered. They talked in hushed tones at coffee shops, in grocery store aisles, in the hallways of schools and businesses. They shared stories of intimidation, of fear, of corruption. The Dolton Dictator, the name began to spread. But the people still hesitated. Who would dare stand against her? She had built an empire within Dolton. The resources of the town were in her hands, and those who opposed her knew the consequences. Her control was absolute. Or so she thought. Because in the shadows of her growing power, a resistance was beginning to take shape. A challenge was coming. One that even she would not be able to ignore. The transformation did not happen overnight. It was gradual, deliberate, so subtle that by the time the people of Dolton realized what had occurred, Tiffany Henyard had already solidified her grip on power. What had once been a town hungry for change had now become a town trapped in an illusion of progress, with its leader at the center of it all. Her promises still rang in the ears of those who had voted for her. The banners that bore her name still decorated public events, each one a reminder of the woman who had once been their hope. But beneath the surface, a different reality was taking shape, one where money flowed in strange directions, where silence was rewarded, and where opposition was crushed before it could grow strong enough to challenge her. The first true test of Henyard's authority came with the handling of Dolton's finances. As the town struggled with its long-standing economic issues, she made a show of securing funding for new projects, renovated parks, road repairs, community initiatives. These were visible changes, tangible signs that the administration was making an impact. But as the projects unfolded, questions began to arise. Construction delays became commonplace, with little explanation beyond bureaucratic setbacks. The companies hired for these projects were not the ones expected, nor were they the most qualified. Contracts were awarded in secrecy, without proper bidding processes, and the businesses involved all had ties leading back to Henyard's closest allies. Local government officials started asking questions. Where was the money going? Why did the numbers not align with what had been allocated in the town's budget? Those tasked with overseeing the town's finances noticed discrepancies in spending reports, figures that simply did not make sense. The first red flags were raised by internal auditors, but before they could be fully investigated, key figures in the financial department either resigned or were removed. Some left voluntarily, unwilling to be part of what was unfolding. Others were forced out, their positions quietly filled with individuals loyal to Henyard's administration. The shift was so well executed that the general public never took notice. Those who had once monitored the town's finances were gone, replaced by a network of officials who owed their careers to the mayor. There was no one left to question the decisions being made, at least, not from within the system. But outside of it, whispers had started. Journalists covering Dolton noticed the unusual silence surrounding financial matters. Reports on town budgets became increasingly vague, with fewer details being shared than in previous years. Public documents that had once been readily available to residents became harder to access, buried under layers of red tape and bureaucratic delays. The mayor's office dismissed concerns, insisting that everything was under control. And yet, signs of financial mismanagement became harder to ignore. Some essential services saw budget cuts, with explanations that funds had been reallocated for higher priority projects. Schools struggled to secure the resources they needed, community programs found themselves underfunded, and public works projects often stalled due to unexpected budget constraints. But while parts of Dolton were suffering, others flourished. Certain businesses, those with close personal ties to Henyard's administration, thrived, securing contracts, grants, and tax breaks that were unavailable to others. A select group of individuals, all within Henyard's circle, seemed immune to the financial struggles facing the rest of the town. It was not just about money, it was about control. The longer she remained in power, the more she ensured that those around her owed their success to her. Every promotion, every contract, every opportunity that arose in Dolton was carefully directed toward those who had proven their loyalty. Henyard was no longer just a mayor. She was a queen, ruling over a town where only those who served her interests prospered. The people did not see it, not yet. They saw only what they were meant to see: the cleaned-up streets, the smiling faces at ribbon-cutting ceremonies, the carefully curated messages broadcast through social media. They saw a mayor who was making a difference, a leader who was constantly in the public eye, always speaking about the importance of progress, community, and resilience. What they did not see were the people who had been forced out, the voices that had been silenced, the reporters whose investigations were met with veiled threats and sudden obstructions. Dissenters were handled with precision. Those who publicly criticized her administration often found themselves at the center of manufactured controversies. Business owners who spoke out about unfair treatment were audited or hit with sudden violations that forced them to shut down. Employees who leaked information faced retaliation in ways that were difficult to trace but impossible to ignore. And yet, her control was not absolute, at least, not yet. A growing number of people had started to notice the patterns, the way certain individuals were favored while others struggled. The initial loyalty she had once commanded began to waver as small inconsistencies piled up. But fear was a powerful force, and as long as Henyard had the means to punish those who opposed her, resistance remained quiet. Until Jason House. A former ally, once a trusted member of her administration, House had watched the slow decay from within. He had believed in her vision, had supported her efforts, had stood by her side when she took office. But over time, he had seen what others could not, or rather, what others were too afraid to acknowledge. He had witnessed the way power corrupted, how the mayor had shifted from a leader to a ruler, how her priorities had changed from helping the town to controlling it. He had confronted her, had tried to reason with her, had attempted to warn her about the direction she was taking. But Henyard was no longer someone who accepted criticism. She saw dissent as a threat, and threats were meant to be eliminated. House was forced out, his reputation smeared, his career in Dolton all but destroyed. But unlike others, he did not disappear. He had seen too much, knew too many of her secrets, and had nothing left to lose. And that made him dangerous. Because now, he was the only one who could challenge her. The first public accusations against Henyard's administration came from him, and the impact was immediate. For the first time since her rise to power, there was resistance that could not be silenced. For the first time, Dolton had an opposition that could not be erased. The mayor had grown accustomed to ruling without consequences, but Jason House was a reminder that even the most powerful could fall. And if she could not stop him, then everything she had built was at risk of collapsing. The battle for Dolton was no longer a quiet one. The illusion of progress had begun to fade, and the weight of reality pressed down on the town's residents like an unshakable shadow. What had once been whispers of corruption were now undeniable truths. The mayor's financial mismanagement, abuse of power, and suppression of opposition had transformed from rumors into open secrets. The people knew. They might not have spoken about it openly, but they knew. And yet, Henyard still ruled. Her control was not simply political, it was systemic. She had entrenched herself into every layer of Dolton's government, ensuring that those who served her would rise, and those who defied her would fall. The administration had been reshaped in her image, and any remnants of independent oversight had long since been erased. The council that was meant to serve as a check on the mayor's power had become nothing more than an extension of her will. Dissenters had been removed. Those who remained had been rewarded for their loyalty, their silence bought with promotions, funding, and the kind of political protection that only someone at the very top could provide. By the time Jason House's opposition campaign began to gain traction, Henyard had already begun her silent takeover. Her strategy was not one of outright force, but of systematic elimination. She did not need to fight back against every accusation that was thrown her way, she simply needed to discredit those who spoke them. And she was good at it. Jason House, once a respected member of the community, had transformed into a pariah overnight. His history was dragged into the spotlight, his past picked apart in the most public way possible. Every mistake he had ever made, every decision that could be twisted against him, became part of an aggressive campaign to paint him as untrustworthy, unreliable, and desperate for power. The attacks were relentless. One by one, former allies distanced themselves from him, either out of fear or because they had been bought. News stations that once covered his work now focused on his supposed failings. His name became synonymous with failure, and his credibility crumbled before his very eyes. It was a playbook that Henyard had perfected. Control the narrative, discredit the opposition, and ensure that the people saw her as their only viable choice. But House refused to disappear. The accusations that had been thrown his way were not enough to break him, and in a town where desperation had become the norm, he found allies among those who had suffered under Henyard's rule. Business owners who had been pushed out of Dolton's economic system, former city officials who had been forced into silence, and citizens who had once believed in Henyard but had been abandoned by her promises, they became his coalition. And they were not alone. The FBI was watching. Federal investigators had been quietly gathering evidence for months, tracking the financial inconsistencies, the misallocation of funds, the contracts awarded to companies with direct connections to Henyard's inner circle. The pieces of the puzzle had finally begun to form a picture, and that picture was one of fraud, corruption, and blatant abuse of power. But Henyard had anticipated this. She had spent years fortifying her position, ensuring that even if the government turned against her, she would still control the town. And her final strategy was her boldest yet. She did not simply seek re-election, she sought absolute control. With election season approaching, she pushed through policy changes that would further centralize power in the mayor's office. She increased executive authority, reduced the influence of the town council, and pushed for stricter voting regulations that would make it harder for opposition voices to gain traction. And most importantly, she tightened her grip on law enforcement. Dolton's police department, long underfunded and struggling, became another instrument of her power. Officers who were loyal to her were rewarded, while those who questioned her leadership were removed. It was a slow militarization, a gradual shift that allowed the mayor to wield law enforcement as a weapon. Protesters who spoke out against her were met with sudden arrests, community leaders who challenged her authority found themselves targeted by investigations, and anyone who dared to organize against her faced mysterious legal troubles that seemed to appear out of nowhere. It was not just politics anymore, it was survival. The people of Dolton were afraid, and fear was the final tool that Henyard needed to maintain control. But even fear has its limits. Because while Henyard tightened her grip, the people were waking up. Jason House was still fighting. The FBI was still investigating. And no amount of smoke and mirrors could erase the reality that was becoming impossible to ignore. The mayor who had once promised change had instead delivered tyranny. And the people of Dolton were finally ready to fight back. The air in Dolton had changed. It was not just discontent anymore. It was rage. For months, Tiffany Henyard had ruled with unchecked power, dismissing allegations, silencing opposition, and consolidating control over every branch of local government. But now, the walls she had built to protect herself were closing in on her. The FBI's investigation into Dolton's finances had reached its final stages. Investigators had uncovered millions of dollars in misallocated funds, shady contracts, and evidence of fraud that could not be ignored. But more importantly, key witnesses, former city officials, contractors, and even members of her own administration, had begun to turn against her. The tide was shifting. For the first time in years, the people of Dolton were no longer afraid. They had watched as businesses collapsed under unfair regulations, as their tax dollars vanished, as law enforcement became a weapon for political suppression. They had stood by in fear, believing that nothing could be done. But the moment Jason House's resistance movement gained momentum, everything changed. The opposition candidate had transformed from a political rival into the face of rebellion. His campaign was no longer just about winning an election, it was about restoring democracy in Dolton. His supporters grew in number, gathering in the streets. The protests that Henyard had once easily dismissed now spilled across the city, becoming too large to ignore. The Dolton Dictator was finally losing control. The day of the mayoral election arrived with tension unlike anything Dolton had ever seen. The people came in droves, determined to cast their votes, determined to be heard. But Henyard was not about to let them win easily. On the morning of the election, reports surfaced that voting centers were suddenly understaffed, long lines formed, and ballot shortages mysteriously occurred in districts known for opposing her rule. Even in defeat, she was playing the game. But the people would not be silenced this time. They stayed in line, waiting for hours, refusing to be pushed away. By the time the final votes were counted, the result was clear. Jason House had won. The people had won. Dolton had chosen to fight back. Henyard refused to accept the results. Her administration immediately challenged the legitimacy of the election, claiming voter fraud, outside interference, and even suggesting that the FBI had sabotaged the results. She held one last press conference, her final attempt at saving herself. She spoke of betrayal, of conspiracies, of the deep state coming for her. But no one believed her anymore. Her allies were nowhere to be found. The businesses that had once profited from her corruption had distanced themselves, desperate to avoid being pulled down with her. Her loyal officials, those who had enabled her rise, had flipped. She stood alone. And then, the breaking point. Just days after the election, the FBI made their move. The agency had enough evidence to move forward, and Henyard was officially charged with corruption, fraud, and misuse of public funds. It was not just about politics anymore, it was criminal. When the news broke, Dolton erupted. The same people who had once cheered for her election were now celebrating her downfall. The same businesses that had once benefited from her rule were now scrambling to sever their ties. She had built an empire on fear, but fear had a short lifespan. And in the end, the people chose justice over fear. In the days following Henyard's removal from office, Dolton was left with a choice. Would they recover from the damage she had done? Could the new administration rebuild what had been broken? The task ahead was immense. The town's finances were in ruins, trust in local government was shattered, and businesses were still hesitant to reinvest in a town that had barely survived its worst political crisis. But the people were no longer blind. They had seen what power unchecked could do, and they would never let it happen again. Jason House took office with a promise, not just to repair Dolton, but to change its culture. He pushed for new transparency measures, for government accountability, for a town where no leader could ever abuse their power the way Henyard had. It would not be easy. But it was a start. And as Dolton took its first steps toward recovery, the nation watched and learned. Because Tiffany Henyard was not the first leader to betray the trust of her people. And she would not be the last. But her story served as a warning. A reminder that no matter how powerful a leader becomes, no matter how strong their grip on a town, a city, or a country may seem, the people always have the power to fight back.